The following presentation was made at the Opryland Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee, for CALLERLAB's 16th Annual Convention, 1989.
And it's time for the next session now. We just finished.
We went over 80 acres to find you. 88. There's only 55.
Time check. I have 27 after. Does that do? We'll wait for 3 more minutes.
You gotta wait 3 more minutes?
Yeah, unless you have to zoom over to the other one and get it started.
Bob, it's 3:30 right now. Go ahead.
Okay. We've got a few people coming in, and we'll start just as soon as they... Did you feel others were coming behind you? Could you tell? Were you lost? All right. I think we'll go ahead and start, and we welcome all of you. The 3 of us are going to have some fun. It's going to be rather informal, and we're just going to talk to you, and we're going to talk among ourselves. And I'd like to meet the members of the Remembrance panel here. On my right, from Aurora, Colorado, which isn't too far away from Denver, is Herb Egender. And Herb will be speaking in a few minutes on some beginnings. And over on my left is Bob Howell, who will be speaking on some endings. And Bob is from Euclid, Ohio. And I would like to start with a prologue, and I'd like to end with, what's the opposite of a prologue? An epilogue? I'd like to end with one of those. So if I can, I'd like to borrow you and take a little trip in time to July 13, 1950. And the place is Santa Monica, California, at the intersection where Wilshire Boulevard hits Ocean Avenue. It makes a large T, and right on the other side of Ocean Avenue are the cliffs that go down to the ocean. So you more or less have a picture of where we're taking you. It has been a busy day getting the streets all fixed for square dancing. It's the 75th, the Diamond Jubilee, 75th anniversary of the city of Santa Monica, California. And they decided that they would have the world's largest square dance. And they figured that what they would do is to publicize that they would have 10,000 people. And the thing started right on time with the drum and bugle corps and with lights and dancers from all over the state of California. And right smack at 7:30, the squares were all set on the pavement, ready to go. And we started square dancing, and for half an hour, the first of the 35 callers that were chosen by the callers themselves started calling. Now remember, this was 1950, and the square dancing was just 2 or 3 years old in our area at that time. Just about half an hour into it, you saw red lights down at the end and sirens, and the motorcycle group brought a shining Cadillac convertible. And in the back of it was the governor of our state, later to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren. And he came up and he came on the stage and sat down and said he'd stay a little while. But I might just tell you in advance, he stayed the whole evening. In 15 minutes later, we saw more red lights coming down the street. And as they came down, the people began to converge on the convertible. And it took them, just to go 2 blocks, it took them 15 minutes. So solid was the mound of square dancers who went up to the car to say thank you to the man who had brought square dancing to California and to the rest of the country in a rebirth that was so overwhelming in our area. The man in the back of the car, together with his wife, was Dr. Lloyd Shaw. His wife, name was Dorothy, and we called him Pappy. And he was the one that we put the responsibility on and the thanks on for what he had brought us in the way of joy and fun throughout our area and throughout the country. And with that as a start, we'd like to tell you a little bit about the man, and then at the epilogue, we'll tell you a little bit more about him. But right now, we take you back, 150 years to when Herb first met Pappy Lloyd Shaw. Herb Egender.
It was only 140. Boy, that's terrible. But I guess that's the best we can do. As I look around the room, I am disappointed in one aspect, as I always am when we do a session like this, and that is that I don't see a lot of younger callers and younger callers' partners in these sessions. Well, the average would be, I won't even say. I think our history and our heritage is very important to us. It should be very important to us, and I think we need to know something about it. I think if we know something about it, we can spice up our classes and our dances and make square dancing more interesting for our dancers. It's really interesting to go back and study a little bit about the history of the dance from the early days of the Morris dancers in England, teams of 6 men who did the dances. The ladies weren't allowed to participate in those days. To see how dances were taken from the various countries to France and modified, and how France produced the quadrille and the cotillion, which was a dance done in a square formation. The contredanse anglaise and the contredanse française. It's interesting to speculate where did dance begin to begin with. We think possibly it was an art which imitated the actions of the animals. Research has shown for a fact that there are tribes of apes in Africa who do ritual dances pretty much in the form of a square. If you come to my area, you're all ahead of me. If you come to my area, I can show you some of those tribes, I think. But that's long, going back perhaps too far. I think most of you probably know that there are really 2 men that are quite responsible for bringing square dancing as we know it to the forefront in this country. One of them was the great industrialist Henry Ford, and the story of how he ran into square dancing at this inn where he used to vacation, and then brought that square dancing back to Detroit is an interesting story in itself. But just after Henry Ford, in the 1930s, this man came along that we know as Dr. Lloyd Pappy Shaw. And Pappy Shaw was the principal of a little school in Colorado Springs, Colorado, called Cheyenne Mountain School. And it was at that school that Pappy became interested in square dancing, and where he decided that square dancing was really an integral and interesting part of our national history, and particularly our Western history, and that he wanted to know more about this square dancing. Pappy entered into this project to learn more about square dancing with great enthusiasm, as he did with everything that he did. And he went out throughout the West, and he talked to old musicians, old fiddlers, old callers, and he drew out from them material which nobody had ever seen before. And he recorded some of their old calls, some of the old fiddle tunes, some of the music, and put his findings down in a book, which I think many of you have certainly. It's called Cowboy Dancing, first produced in 1939, Caxton Publishers. in Caldwell, Idaho. And that book, Cowboy Dances, together with the exhibition teams that Pappy took around the country, really started the spark for square dancing as we know it around the country. Well, who was this man, Pappy Shaw? I just happened, he put out another book, which was a round dance book later on. And I had occasion to be looking through the round dance book the other day, and I ran into the preface of that book. The preface was written by Thomas Hornsby Farrell, who is the poet laureate of Colorado and really a world-renowned poet and author. And I knew Pappy pretty well because I was in Cheyenne School for 12 years. Then I went to 4th grade. It was a small school, total population grades 1 through 12 of less than 200 students. And we all know Pappy pretty well. I spent quite a bit of time in Pappy's office. My late wife, Erna, and I started going together in 8th grade in that school. And Pappy didn't like young people going together. And he coined a term for it, which I loved, and he called it conspicuous coupling. And so we were frequently in his office for conspicuous coupling. So I got to know Pappy pretty well. Let me read you just some of this preface by Thomas Hornsby Farrell, because I think that it describes Pappy the man quite well. Lloyd Shaw is an American genius. We in Colorado are proud to share him with our sister states and neighboring countries, which have now caught up with what we have always known about him. The old square dances were never lost in America, but due to something temporarily lost in ourselves, got misplaced. Through Lloyd Shaw, more than any other man, we were able to restore our own dances to our own spirit. Now, in this new book, he's talking about the round dance book, he is giving us renewed access to our old round dances, etc., etc. Over many years, I have seen this thing happen. This thing Lloyd Shaw does in a lovely canyon under the shadow of Pike's Peak. I readily understand why his Cheyenne Mountain School, I say his, although it is a public school, has become a shrine for people who want to know why the American dance is what it is and how to do it. They come from everywhere, New England, the Corn Belt, the Southern Mountains, Hollywood, and Northwest. Perhaps some of them think they are coming to hear or learn dance steps, dance tunes, and dance calls, just as some people think they can learn to write poetry by first learning how to make rhymes, meters, and word patterns. Fortunately, these people get what they came for, but it happens the other way around. The steps, the calls, the movements are taken in as a sort of unconscious corollary to learning the dance itself. Lloyd Shaw, from the first moment, gives you the feeling of being the dance, which is quite different from being about to learn how to dance. Yet if the actual learning seems almost to come as an afterthought, there's no blundering on the way. He bears down with a radiant, booming discipline. Your right hand knows what your left hand is doing, and it doesn't forget. And then he goes on. Pappy was a very dominating personality. He did have a booming voice. He was a hard-headed cuss. And he was a very demanding taskmaster, but all with a lot of love for the people with whom he was working. As I say, I went to Cheyenne Mountain School for 12 years, and I had Pappy as a teacher at various points along that school. One of the classes I had with Pappy was Western history. Gosh, what a teacher of Western history. Because he knew Western history, and he didn't just talk about it. If he was going to tell us about Bent's Fort, he didn't just tell us about Bent's Fort. We all got up and left the classroom, went down and crawled into the old school bus, and drove down to Bent's Fort. And we spent the day down there wandering around the grounds where the old pioneers were defending themselves from Indian attacks and so forth. What a great experience for a bunch of school kids. And this was his approach to everything. In our senior English class, when we did Shakespeare, Pappy didn't just read about King Lear. He did not just read King Lear. Pappy was King Lear. And our senior English class was in a room at the top of the school, sort of off in a corner. It was our library, actually. And when Pappy did King Lear or Macbeth or any of those things, I don't care where you were in the school, you could hear the windows rattle with his voice. And because he would just boom and he'd play those parts. And what a terrific experience that was. And as I say, that was his approach. And so when he formed his dance teams, and we went on our trips across the country, and our first trip across country was in 1930. And we were invited to go to the National Folk Festival in Washington, D.C., and participate as kind of a last-minute add-on. We were really not a part of the regular program. And we climbed in the old, brand new 1938 Ford bus and headed across country with Pappy and, thank God, Dorothy, because she saved our lives. And our bus driver, one year it was Nick, one year Barney. Sometimes Nick went along as a fiddler. And our study hall teacher, Teach Johnson, who played the piano. And we headed off across country, heading for Washington, D.C. We, of course, got to Washington, D.C. and did our little bit of a program in Constitution Hall at the National Folk Festival. And by audience demand, instead of being on that program just that one evening, we were there for the entire festival every night, and we danced. And we stayed in a very quaint campground, which generates thousands of stories, some of which I couldn't even tell you. But first time I learned about corn cobs, and and these were not for making pipes out of either. But anyhow, we went. We danced on that trip. We had National Folk Festival. We went to Swarthmore College. Went on to New York, and we instructed and danced at Columbia University in the city of New York. Can you imagine a bunch of green kids from Colorado, cowboy boots with the pants tucked in the top of the boots, cowboy hats, shirts, neckerchiefs around the neck, and here we are running around New York City, creating lots of stares. New York City, went to Vermont, Bennington School of the Dance in Vermont, on up into Canada. I think it was that trip we went on down through Detroit and stopped there at Henry Ford's place, and we were able to dance in Lovett Hall, the beautiful dance hall that Henry Ford built for and named after the dancing master that he brought back with him from the inn on the East Coast. And then we went on down to Chicago University. We danced there. University of Kansas, and I guess home. Our next trip was out to the West Coast that same year, and we spent a week at the University of California instructing and dancing there. Very, very arduous trips. We traveled all day in that little cramped-up bus, and we danced hours on time. But Pappy, above all, was an educator. And no matter where we went, his primary objective was to see that his kids were taken care of and that their education was not neglected. First of all, in order to get on the dance team, it was a competitive thing, and then in order to go on the trip, you had to have all of your work done ahead of time for the 2 weeks that you would be gone, and you had to be carrying a pretty good grade average. No matter where we went, if there was a museum, a garden, a statue, whatever it might be of historical significance or of interest or of educational value to Pappy's kids, we saw it. I don't care if it was closed. I don't care if it was not open to the public. Those were minor inconveniences to Pappy. He had more brass than anybody I've ever seen. He would simply find out who was in charge of the place, and regardless of the time of the day or night, he'd just roust them out. And he'd say, hey, look here, I've got a bunch of kids from Colorado here, and we're going across country, and I think it's important that they see this museum. And I'd appreciate it very much if you just opened it up and let us in. And I'll be danged if most everybody didn't do it. And so we got in and we saw so many things that even the general public would not have seen because they didn't have Pappy with them. And wherever we went, he made sure that that happened. And, for example, when we were in New York City, he made sure that we got down into New York City and went to a nightclub there, which was at that time called The Barn. And it was kind of a Western motif nightclub. But he took us down there and let us spend an evening there and have a hamburger. I still have the menu from that nightclub. The prices make you want to cry. I forget, the hamburger was 15 cents, I think, something like that. But no matter what it was, he wanted to make sure that we flavored the atmosphere of where we were and we saw the important things. And this was, of course, as we were dancing and teaching and working with the people in such places as Swarthmore, Chicago University, New York University, Bennington School of the Dance, Kansas State University, University of California, and so forth. So it was a terrific experience for all of us going around the country. I said earlier, thank God for Dorothy Shaw, his wife, Dorothy Stott Shaw, who was a remarkable person in her own right. She was poetess laureate of the state of Colorado on several different occasions. Wonderful, sweet woman, and the only thing that saved our lives. I said that Pappy had a lot of brass. I think a great deal of it was concentrated in his kidneys. Or maybe it was steel, I don't know. But he had a fantastic cross-country capacity. And if it had not been for Dorothy shaking him periodically and saying, Pappy, I think we better stop and let the kids out, I don't know what would have happened. Pappy, when we were practicing and working, time meant nothing to Pappy. And I think some of us would have been danced clear down to our knees had it not been for Dorothy saying, Pappy, it's been 2 hours. Don't you think it's time perhaps we let him sit down a little bit? So she was our mother, and she guarded over us and kind of put a restrainer on Pappy, because he was a driver, he was enthusiastic, he was a taskmaster, he was a dominating, not necessarily a domineering, but a dominating figure, and he needed somebody like Dorothy to play the counterpart, and she did it beautifully. They made a great team. that brings us up to about 1940. It's a funny thing about that's about all the dance experiences. A couple of personal things. I had an instructor in college once that said, "I hope you'll excuse me for illustrating my talk with personal experiences, but they're the only kind I've ever had." So, I told you about conspicuous coupling. There was another couple in school that went together, and they were also in Pappy's office quite frequently for conspicuous coupling. Eileen Brunson and Joe Willett. And Pappy used to lecture us about the dire consequences of such behavior and how it would never come to anything and so forth. And the funny part of it was we graduated from high school, and both the other couple and Erna and I were married on exactly the same day. And a couple of very successful marriages. That kind of made Pappy mad. He did not. He was a bad loser. He did not like to lose. He didn't lose very often. But after we were married, I went over. It was during wartime. I went overseas, and for 2 years, Pappy would not talk to Erna. He just would hardly speak to her because we had proven his prediction wrong. And in the course of the war, I was shot down, was a PW for a while, and when that happened, why, Pappy changed, and we all became friends again. But it was kind of funny to see him change. He just didn't like to lose. He did not like to be wrong. He was so seldom that he just simply couldn't get used to it. But Pappy was a remarkable man, and the only way you can tell what kind of person Pappy was is to tell some of these stories, because he brought that same kind of character into square dancing. Had he not, we would not have what we have today. Had he not been persistent, had he not been kind of dominating, had he not been enthusiastic, he would not have been able to go to some of these old-time fiddlers and callers and get from them the material that they had. Many of you in here can remember back not too many years when you couldn't get anything out of a caller. You went to a caller's dance, and he had some good patter he was using, and he saw you come in, he wouldn't use it. You asked him for it, and he wouldn't give it to you. That was his patter. It wasn't like it is today, where you can go to caller schools and you got all this printed material and so forth. So if Pappy had not been the kind of person that he was, there's no way that he would have gotten the material that he put in Cowboy Dances in 1939. But he was able to get it, and he was able to give us this book, which really formed the foundation for our modern square dancing.
You done? I better quit, hadn't I?
Did any of you people ever have the opportunity to have seen the Cheyenne Mountain Dancers in a performance? Oh, you're youngsters. My section of the story comes after Herb's and before Bob's, and it has to start with a series of personal experiences and what I was looking for. When I went to college, and this was before the war, I had a responsibility of trying to melt a group of students. It was a small college in Los Angeles area, and students came from all over the country and from outside the country. And they would start it with a howdy dance or a welcome dance, and the people would come and they'd look in the door and then they'd leave. Or they might sit on the sideline and then they'd go away. And it was an absolute failure. The members of the student council would come in and maybe do a little ballroom dancing, but nobody else would come in. And one summer I happened to go to Arizona with a fraternity brother, and I happened to end up in a place called Payson. And I don't know if any of you have been in the Arizona area, but I watched a wedding dance. A couple got married in the storeroom, and when it was over, the wedding was over, they brought a bale of hay and they took out all the, ran it back and forth and took out all the splinters so that they could square dance. The bride and the groom came, and they had room for 2 squares, and each square had its own caller. The musicians were 3 pieces on 2 instruments. A piano with no keys and no white ivory on the keys, and the man sitting on the same bench bowed a fiddle across his lap, and his grandmother sitting across had knitting needles and played the straws. At any rate, I watched, and I thought, now, gosh, what they're doing here might go well in college. And I went back, and that next fall I was responsible for some of the school activities that year, and we tried square dancing. And to make a long story very, very short, I found that square dancing was just not the end of it. It was what square dancing did. It brought a bunch of people who didn't know each other together, and it was a great experience, and I learned from it. And during the years that followed, almost immediately, when we went into the war, we had many, many men and women in the services traveling through the Los Angeles area, and just sort of free on Saturday nights, and nothing to do except some of the nightclubs, and we had Hollywood Canteen and a few of those things. But we had a group that had a service center down at the railroad station, and we brought any of the people home with us, filled up our homes, and then gave them a square dance at night. Now, what I knew about square dancing at that time was what I learned in about 15 minutes in Arizona. It wasn't very much. But here again, these fellas and these girls that were about to be shipped overseas knew no one. They didn't have the feeling of home, and they were looking for friendship. And it was this square dancing that I found was a magic elixir that could bring these people together. That was number 2. Number 3, in our area, right immediately following the war, we had hordes of people coming back from the war. People that had just gotten married or were married during the war were looking for places to settle down, and new communities were springing up. And people came in moving next door to each other who didn't know each other. And we started square dancing as a means of bringing people together, not as a recreation in itself, but as a means toward an end, to make people enjoy each other. And the natural ability to move to music and the fun of taking hands seemed to be the thing that was needed. We had no square dance clubs. We had a folk dance club, and we would dance maybe an evening of folk dances, a Russian share and a Mexican dance and a couple of those things. And one night, Ray Shaw, who was one of our group, said that his brother was coming. He was going to do the screen work on Selznick's Duel in the Sun with Gregory Peck and a whole bunch of famous Hollywood actors. And so that night at the folk dance, Lloyd Shaw came, and we met him for the first time, although we'd heard of him. And as he watched the dance that evening, and he watched a half a dozen of us who were callers at the time, and each one of us brought our own records just in case somebody said, you know, we'd like you to call the one tip of square dancing during the evening. And he saw how many people got up for that. And he said to us afterwards, why are you putting yourself into the spot of just having one dance? Why don't you start your own activity? And that was the beginning. Within the next week, we started a square dance, just square dancing and couple dancing. And from that point on, and this was 1946 or 1947, I figured that this man, this gentleman from Colorado, had an answer that I was looking for, and perhaps others were too. In 1947, I applied for one of his summer schools where he taught individuals who knew a little bit about square dancing how to call. I got accepted, and that was the greatest day. And there were the little cafeteria at Cheyenne Mountain School held about 12 squares crowded. And I remember that the water had leaked in it sometime or another, and there was a bulge down the center of the, it was a cafetorium, I guess they used for a gym and everything at that time. And what a thrill it was that first morning coming in and meeting Dale Wagner from Wisconsin, Herb Gregerson from Texas, and all these different people that I heard a little bit about, but suddenly discovering that square dancing was larger than just California. It spread. And that experience went something like this. You started in the morning at 9 o'clock, and Pappy would come in. He was an invalid to an extent. He used 2 canes, and he would come over and he'd sit down on a stool that was in this small auditorium where you and all your gang at one time or another did the Littlest Wise Men plays that he had written. And he would sit and he'd talk to us. Now, he didn't talk about square dancing. He dropped it in a little bit, but there again, it was there because it was meeting a need. He talked about people's desire to move to music. He talked about what square dancing could do to the world, to people, in communities, in bringing people together. And that really was impressive. There were a number of people from Southern California at that first session, and I think we were all equally impressed. Calling was very simple. He would talk about clarity, rhythm, command, the 3 important parts base of the tripod, the calling tripod. I remember those. I know that the other segments on those 3 legs were all important. I remember the top of it. He had the word bubble over, which is the natural ability that some callers have that they could almost buffalo you into thinking that they were the greatest thing in the world, although they might not know much, just simply because of their outgoing personality. His whole philosophy was the thing that got through to us, and we would listen for an hour as he talked about the importance of the things that we discovered were the underlying things behind square dancing for him. Then we would go from the auditorium into the little gym I'd mentioned, and we would dance. We would dance with his calling. We'd do the old waltz quadrilles. Do any of you remember the waltz quadrilles? And we would do the patter calls of the day. And we'd do the couple dances, Varsuviana, and the Black Hawk Waltz, and Laces and Graces. These would be our start of what he taught us was not just the dances, but how to dance tall. And I don't know whether he taught you Cheyenne Mountain dancers this when you were dancing, or whether he learned it from you. But he would say, dance tall. Bring your dining room in, tuck your sitting room in, and if you're a tall man, dance tall. Take a lesson from the short man. Dance as though you were proud of your heritage of square dancing. And even if we only took one small portion of this exaggerated lecture home with us, we still got what he wanted us to get. We would dance with his calling and teaching, and he was never proclaimed to be the greatest teacher in the world, or the greatest caller. He was a great teacher. But I remember when he had done the Duel in the Sun album there in California, that they had him do a Duel in the Sun album. Some of you may have it. They're relics. They're great, and they were big 12-inch discs. And the music was our big problem. We just didn't have very much music, but he called on those. So you still have a chance today to hear what his voice was like. And then we would take turns in calling for evaluation. Now, I think since then we've changed our way of evaluating. We used to, a caller would get up and he'd call, and then we'd all sit down, and different ones of us would critique the man who had just called. And what happens if you're critiquing somebody and you know that in a few minutes you're going to call and they're going to be critiquing you? Very gentle, but not Shaw. He would lambast you, and you never forgot it. I remember I'd developed a style that was very unique with me, and I thought it was the greatest thing that ever happened. Some callers tap with their right foot, some with the left, some alternate right then left. I swung my bustle. And as I would swing back and forth, that was my rhythm keeper, and the greatest embarrassment to have him stand behind me and hold my bottom as I tried to call. It's funny how you remember things like that. Be funnier if I forgot it. At any rate, that was 1947. And it was from that inspiration that our whole area grew, because there were several of us from California at that session. We went back, and I think within the next short period of time, we had our first classes in California. Up to that time, remember the old classes? Well, remember how we used to do it. Everybody come into a dance, and if you were going to learn anything, you might learn at the first tip, but you always took number 4 spot. And then by the time the first couple went out and did their bit, then the second, then the third, you had learned the whole cotton picking dance, and then you would do it. But now, when we went back there in 47, we learned some new things. An alamandar, and all around your left-hand lady, and seesaw your little taw. Those things had to be taught. And when we brought them back to California, there must have been, 20 of us or something like that had been back to this small class. And we all immediately, the first one that got off the plane almost started teaching. One fellow was from Texas that he came, and he was the only one from that section of Texas. So he took these two particular dances, and he said, I'll teach one now, and I'll wait a few months before I teach the other one. And he taught on the first one, Alamandar, and the group really did it for 3 or 4 or 5, 6 months, and then he broke out all around in seesaw and taught it backwards. And for years and years, Texas danced all around your left-hand lady, seesaw your pretty little taw, with a left shoulder around the corner, right shoulder around your partner. And when Joe Lewis went down, Joe was one caller that Pappy Shaw thought was the greatest caller ever. When Joe went down to Australia as a guest of the Australians to teach, he showed them how to do all around and seesaw backwards. So it took Australia a long time to get out of it. California grew. And as it grew, by that was 47 when we first got our indoctrination back there. By 1948, we had 2 associations starting, plus a callers group called the Powwow, plus a magazine called Sets in Order. And we decided that this would be a time to bring Shaw back to our area and have him teach the dancers of Southern California the styling that we had gotten in his classes. And the square dancing was really on such an upswing at that particular point in time that we had only room in the Hollywood High School auditorium for one couple out of each club to come and be a part of that clinic that he was going to teach for 3 days. The place was full. It was a very exciting thing. But it comes down to this, that if there hadn't been a Pappy Shaw, there might have been somebody else. I've thought in the years since of the different people that I've met that were old-timers in the activity, who it might have been. But it took that magnetic feeling, that contagious thing that he had that impressed us so much, to really get us off our rusty dusties and get moving in the activity and developing a strong activity. And we've always been very, very grateful. There'll be more things that Herb will think of and that I'll think of, and then I do have an epilogue. But now let's go to more modern times and Bob Howell.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, I guess my greatest regret was I didn't listen to a physical education teacher that I had back in Cleveland Heights. Little gal tried for years to get me to this wonderful place out in Colorado, but every summer was spent, I guess, trying to make bread. With a young family, I just didn't have the time to go to Colorado. And I live to regret it because I came into the Shaw life, and he came into my life shortly before he passed away. But I did have the opportunity of knowing him, and I almost said working with him, playing along with him, because although I guess I did work along with him. When Pappy said something, I did it. I never questioned. Although, I'm going to kind of. He could make the whole cabin roll. Just the windows would rattle. In that, when I came into Pappy's life, or he came into my life, the school building was still there. However, Lloyd Shaw had retired from the school business, and he had built a little dance hall right in his front yard. How many zoning laws would permit this today? He built this little cabin, or little dance hall it was. It would hold, I think, 3 sets comfortably, maybe 4, I don't know. But he just took the dance from the school, because when he left the school, he took his dancing with him. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me come back for a moment. Dorothy Shaw. I want to say something about her first before I get on to Pappy, because Dorothy had a greater influence on my life and my dancing than Pappy did, because Dorothy and I spent years, I think, 26 or 28 summers out there in Colorado. And most of those were spent with Dorothy Shaw. In fact, I've said before, I wish that there wasn't the Lloyd Shaw Foundation. I just wish it was the Shaw Foundation, because Dorothy, as Herbert alluded to, her silent partner portion of Pappy's life was so influential, both with the kids and with dancers generally. It certainly, there was a good bit of guidance on her part. Highly supportive woman. She was behind Pappy all the time, and I often wonder what might have gone on after the sessions were over, because Pappy was so positive, and I know that Dorothy must certainly, behind every successful young man, is a very surprised mother-in-law. But in this case, I think it was probably a very surprised wife, because she did straighten him out. And they both had a great effect on me. On my life and my attitude toward dance, because I still agree with Pappy. I'm more concerned with how you dance rather than what you dance, and that I've heard these two fellas say that many times too. He was a large man. He was a big fella. He walked with these 2 canes, and he would come into the dance hall each morning following the same format, and he wouldn't sit on this stool. He had kind of a bar stool. It was a real high thing, and he'd kind of almost lean on that stool. He didn't sit too well, and would kind of lean back, and would, again, his morning lectures were very, very inspirational. I'd have to go home many times, many days, or at noon, and ask my wife what he was inferring, because Phyllis would pick up the points that he was making, and I just was enamored by listening to the man speak. And it wasn't all dance. It was living. He could change your ideas on things without being domineering in his talks. Now, when it came to calling and when it came to your dancing, why, that was a horse of another shade. He was a gentleman. I would say that of him because, for the instance, and I'm going to allude to this right now. I came in wearing a big old 10-gallon hat, and I got up there to call the first time, and I had my hat on. And he said, a gentleman doesn't wear his hat indoors. I thought, well, my golly, I had to let him know. It's like taking a picture of your football team at school. You have to have one guy sitting there holding a football to make sure everybody knows that it's a football team, or a basketball team, or a hockey team. They have to hold a hockey stick or something like that. Well, I thought that hat meant I was a caller, and so he got off on one of his lectures one morning about a gentleman, about our dress, and. He got off on a little bit of flamboyancy, too, about fringe. Well, you had fringe on your cuffs. That's where I learned where fringe came from. I'd never known before that those people got sewn into their clothing. And all that fringe was the way to get the moisture out of the leather. In other words, it drew from the leather clothing that was sewn onto their bodies, and it evaporated and gave them a chance to warm up once in a while. But those were things that, you see, in his teaching and in his lectures, there was it ran so deep. But he did get on to me with that, and then, of course, I had a towel on my belt. And he wondered whether I expected to cry or something. Well, the funniest part was on Thursday evening, which was our stunt night, the fellas fixed me up. And, of course, being a neophyte that first year, I didn't realize what they were doing to me. And they really, I think some of them, Dale Wagner and some of the other friends that you mentioned, they got me a beach towel, which I stuck in my belt and dragged for about 8 feet behind me. They made about 14-inch fringes that they sewed all the way down my shirt, and they went up, and Pappy, he probably had picked this up on one of his trips. There was one of these big sombreros, big Mexican hats that went about 6 foot in diameter, and they stuck that on my head. In fact, I can remember coming through the door of the dance hall that night. I had to turn my head sideways to get into the hall. But when I walked out that night to call with all this paraphernalia on, I didn't think Shaw was going to make it through the through the call. That man guffawed like you've never heard anything, and slapped his knee. He really. I was getting back a little bit. The fellas had fixed me up, but he roared. He could take a joke. So here I was, kind of pulling his leg and getting away with it. However, he did straighten me out. I never, after that, ever wore a hat when I called a square dance. Now, I'd been calling for several years before I got out there, do you see? And 10 or 15 years, and I think I wore a hat every night before that, and never have I worn one, at least indoors, since. I was a Johnny-come-lately. It was a short but a very, very wonderful friendship that was developed. I still cherish the letters which I have at home from him, and my autographed copy of the Cowboy Dance book and the Round Dance book. They are probably the most cherished possessions I have in my library. Tell a little bit about Phyllis, and I so often get off on stories of her about my wife, and they've always said, don't ever pick on your wife when she's not around, but I think Phil would subscribe to this story. We got up to waltz. And like Texas not knowing, or Australia not knowing how to do a do paso, I had been taught in the Cleveland Public Schools how to waltz. Well, we learned the box step. The two-step waltz was taught to us by our gym teacher. And so you did the step, close step, and a step, close step, and they were painted. The feet were painted on the floor, and everybody did the same step at the same time. And I see some others have been through the same school. Well, Phyllis herself had never danced. Never before I married her. In fact, I met my wife at a midshipman dance in Chicago. I happened to be walking off a binge from the night before, and I stopped into an Episcopalian tea dance at a church. And I think I must have been still pretty well saturated. And because I walked all over this woman's feet, and I was so embarrassed. But I found out later she had never danced before in her life. She came from a little town in Iowa. That the Mission Covenant was out there. You didn't wear lipstick, you didn't dance, you didn't do any of those real good things. You never went to a movie, And so I just walked all over. I literally did. And so when we got on the floor out there, because I had been calling square dances for a long time. Phyllis wasn't particularly interested. It was a hobby of mine, and she had other interests, so I went out and called square dances. And so we just hadn't danced a great deal. But we got on the floor, and we began to waltz. I'm going to put this microphone about 1.5 feet away from me, because all of a sudden, stop it! Stop it right now! Did I blow that thing apart? Well, that's just about, except about 1,000 decimeters more sound. He says, you're doing the ignoramus waltz! Well, Phyllis started to cry. She looked at me and she says, take me home. I want to get out of here. He just belted it out, and he scared the living daylights out of her. And, of course, I thought, ignoramus waltz, something that I hadn't known before, And so the next morning, there was a session on waltzing, and we learned to waltz. We learned to waltz the next day. But the way he belted that out, I'll tell you, Lordy, trying to catch my own breath, very vehemently. I mean, it upset him, because he saw us doing something we had no business doing, because we were truly not waltzing. She did. She wanted to get onto the next train, get on the next dome liner right back across the prairies again. Dorothy was a gem herself, as I had said before, highly supportive, and I think she took Phyllis up to the house and comforted her for a little while, and we did stay on. Thank goodness, because it was a friendship there that has lasted, well, ever since Dorothy's demise a few years back. Pappy always reiterated, Pappy said that the waltz was the perfect rhythm. The waltz was the most perfect rhythm that there was. I mean, the waltz was the rhythm. Dorothy has always and had always emphasized that the contra was the perfect dance. And to this day, I myself find that my greatest joy is in dancing a waltz contra, because the marriage of those two concepts produce what I feel is something that, I can dance 5 feet off the floor with a waltz contra. He also, Herb alluded to the fact that he taught history, but he taught everything. He even wrote for the local papers, and then it was published later, his science notes, of which Dorothy had given me a copy years ago, a compilation of his knowledge about the local flora, the local fauna, and the local phenomena of science in the Colorado Springs area. He was strict, very strict. There were 2 ways of doing it. I guess there was, as I said one time, the Navy way and Pappy's way. There wasn't even my way, do you see? Let me see. I'm going to skip down here a little bit. Shaw was a great, he opposed organization. And I can still see him sitting there saying, we're going to organize ourselves right off the dance floor. He said, you don't need organization. Because when Pappy really went out, I think he had the concept that he was going to, at some time, bring all dancing to a kind of uniform pattern so that it would be kind of universal anywhere in the country. Then he went down into North Carolina and saw what they were doing down there. Then he went to Henry Ford Museum, to Lovett Hall. It wasn't a museum then, and saw what they were doing. And then he went to Texas, down with Herb Gregerson. He saw what they were doing. Saw that little Abilene lift that some of the Texans were doing down there. He went to California, went to all these places, and then he came to realize that really these were pockets of various types of dance, and they should be left alone. And even today, I still can't help but agree with him that maybe, I don't know, I wonder sometimes if we haven't organized ourselves kind of off the dance floor. He visited these many areas, and he said to me one day in the arbor as we were having lunch, he said, leave the dancing alone. He said, we'll try to bring our cowboy dances together here. But as for the others, don't try to go in and make converts out of anyone. He did a great job. I often wonder today what Pappy's attitude would be toward modern square dancing. Because I've had people say he was a great traditionalist, but yet he was a maverick. He took his kids up to Central City, and they danced up there. What was the name of that hotel up there, Herb?
Williams Barn.
Williams Barn. And they danced, and they did things like Alamandar. Surprised people. Great exhibition figure. Never to be used for regular square dancing. That was much too difficult for most people to do. Well, Do Paso. And I go back again to, which way was it? Do Paso, Texas style, or Do Paso, Colorado style? And I'm sure they went through the same things that we've gone through here at CALLERLAB as to the way that it's done. Dorothy, upon Pappy's demise, picked up the reins. I didn't believe, when I got the letter, Kirby Todd, a friend of mine, wanted me to get out to the funeral, and it was I think in March, if I'm not mistaken. There was no way I could have gone out to the funeral when Pappy died. And so... but there were a lot of heavy hearts because we thought that would be the end of the summer seminars, the summer sessions. However, it did not happen that way. I saw a woman. I saw a lady come out with just absolutely steel bands. I mean, there was never a tear shed. She said, "We are going to dance," and we did. She kept the classes going, but it turned then from a class, as Pappy had taught it, into a fellowship. And she referred to it as a fellowship of dance. And it was shared responsibility. She was great. She was always the mentor. She was always the one that would add in the history, etc., or why it was done this way. She had a great deal of background on it, but yet all the callers were helped along, all that I've ever known out there, by her continued efforts. The fellowship was continued until 1979, and it had influenced many lives, many callers, many dancers, even after Pappy had gone. So I didn't have the fortune that these two gentlemen did. I'd like to relate one or two other things. One was a little swing club there in Colorado Springs. Pappy related to me, or related to the group, about the caller, the importance of the caller, and how when the caller says something, you do it. because a caller came into this little swing club, and he said, all right, all join hands and circle to the right. And nobody did it. And somebody went up and said, we don't do that in this swing club. We always circle to the left. He stood up and he says, all join hands and circle to the right. And the person went back up and said, you don't understand. We don't do that in this little swing club. We always circle to the left. The fellow said, join hands and circle to the right. Nobody did it, and he packed up his equipment and went home. And I said, what, do you think he was right, Pappy? And he said, absolutely. When that caller gave that command, everybody should have been doing what that caller said. I said, amen. Amen and hallelujah. A very, very, very positive person. Legacy, getting started. I can remember Dorothy again. So helpful. One of our very first sessions of Legacy, we got into a real consternation. I don't remember the problem, but we sat till midnight or 1 o'clock, and I'm sure Bob was there that night when we couldn't resolve this thing, and Dorothy finally, about 1 o'clock in the morning, looked over, and she said, you poor dears, why don't you wait till tomorrow morning and we'll solve the problem. We came back in the morning, and it was solved within a very few minutes. But that was just her gentle way, and it worked. The nicest part was Legacy always met on Mother's Day, and Dorothy always flew home on Mother's Day, and she was always the oldest person on the airplane and always got the bottle of champagne. Late in her life, she came to Cleveland for one of the Legacy meetings, and I had her out to the house, and I offered her a little Southern Comfort, which was something I thought might relax her a little bit, and she took a drink. Surprised me. And then finally she told me, she said, the doctor said, never touch the stuff before you're 70, and then never be without it. This great wedding, this great relationship they had, Pappy was not a dancer. I don't know whether you knew it or not. He had, I don't believe, ever danced before he went to college. In fact, he was sitting up in a tree when they were doing some of this, and or they're having a picnic. That was it. Pappy wasn't socially oriented to begin with. I think Dorothy had a great influence on him, too, because Pappy was sitting up in a tree, and he didn't want to do any of that dumb stuff, plenty of those dumb games, and it was shortly after that that they began dancing. Dolly and Don. Dolly is Pappy's daughter, lives in Boise, Idaho, and, by the way, is going to Australia and New Zealand with us in October, which was a sheer joy when she called the other day. And Enid Koch, who is Pappy's granddaughter, is now president of the Lloyd Shaw Foundation, and it's still a very, very active group and is growing all the time. I'm certain that Pappy and Dorothy have left us a legacy that will grow for a long, long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. We're going to move into wrap-up now. Herb has got some thoughts. I just might mention one thing that I recall as we talk here. Pappy said there are two important things in square dancing, the dance and the dancer. And the caller is that lucky individual who stands in the middle and gets credit for bringing the two together. Herb?
How many of you are round dancers? Bob, as we sit here, you get triggered. Bob mentioned Central City, and we danced in Central City for the Central City Opera every summer. I believe it was in 1938. We were dancing in Williams Barn, and this beautiful blonde dancer who is appearing at the Teller House across the street, which is a famous old hotel up there with a face on the barroom floor. She came over and said, may I watch you dance? And Pappy said, well, certainly. And she used to come and watch us dance. And one day she came over to Pappy and she said, would you mind, I love the dancing so much and I love watching you so much. Would you mind if I showed you a little dance that we used to do in my country? And Pappy said, boy, I'd love to have it. Anything new, anything interesting. And she showed him this lovely waltz where the couple waltzed and the lady would put her hand behind her back, the man would take it, and then you would change back and forth. And that lady's name was Tamara. Not Tamara. Her name was Tamara, and she taught us. Pappy said, come here, kids. And he rounded us up, and she taught us that day the Tamara waltz. And that's where we get our Tamara in our modern round dancing. So it's kind of interesting. Boy, that really shows your age. But
Herb, I'm not so sure. I thought Pappy always was in love with her, and she kept saying tomorrow.
Right. As we talk about Pappy, sometimes I'm sure we tend to put him on a pedestal, and a lot of people that didn't know him that well try to do that. And he was so human, I don't like to see that. Pappy's the last guy in the world that would want to be put on a pedestal. But let me just show you how innovative it was, to show you that he was not just an old fogey. Many of you can't think back to the early 1930s, but in the 1930s, Cheyenne School, where Pappy was principal, was the only school in the United States that had its own glider, and the students flew it off the football field. Governor John Love, our former governor in Colorado, being one of those. The Cheyenne School at that time was one of the few, and perhaps the only school around the country that had its own rodeo every year, where the kids participated. Cheyenne School was the only school that I ever heard of during that period of time that had its own off-road automobile club, driving through the gullies and the mountains. I wish you could see some of those old films that were made during that time. It's really hilarious. But this was while Pappy was principal. He was willing to try anything, innovative, new, challenging, and sure, kids got hurt in a rodeo. Sure, once in a while a car would turn over and somebody would get scratched. You couldn't do those things nowadays, could you? Boy, the libel suits, the liability suits, would be terrible. But Pappy was willing to try anything for the kids, anything new, anything innovative. I hear people say something about new square dance callers. Oh boy, Pappy would roll over in his grave. I don't think so. Pappy, I think, would be up there saying, hey, let me take a look at that now. If we do it this way. Yeah, I think if Pappy were alive, he might give Copman fits.
Thank you, Herb. I remember a couple of other things. A caller must first be a dancer, and then a caller. To be a successful dancer, a successful caller, he should be adequate or better as a dancer. A caller should be able to handle all phases of the activity, not just be a specialist in one field, but be able to call and teach the squares, singing as well as patter calls, the couple or round dances, contras, quadrilles. An adequate caller should be a triple threat man at least. There were only, in all the positive things that he talked about, there were only that I remember 2 definite no-nos. Do you know what they were? Competition was one. Square dancing is a competitive, a cooperative activity, not competitive. And I think it's because of his beliefs on this that we have made it such a strong deal with the National Square Dance Convention and with all the other things that have been done. That has been one of the things that we have managed to steer clear of. Competition between callers. He used to tell a story about one particular caller who became world champion. This is in the late 1940s. 2 people had entered the contest, and one didn't show up. The other was world champion. And I remember, as far as competition between dancers was pretty big in the period right after World War II. There was a group from Laramie, Wyoming, that came down to the Panhandle in Texas to a contest. And they had worked a long time with their caller, and they were quite good dancers. But when they danced and the contest was on, they took second place. And the first place dancers were a group from Texas somewhere, and they did a beautiful job. And the kids from Laramie all went up to the kids that had just won, and there was going to be open dancing, the open square dancing for the next tip to finish out the evening. And so each one of the kids from the Laramie group said to the kids that had won, "Will you trade partners with us so that we can have the fun of dancing with you?" They said, "No, we can't dance with anyone else but our own group. We don't know anything but that one pattern that we did." That was all that they did. Shaw used to tell great stories on the set of Duel in the Sun. I saw a picture not long ago. Have you seen it recently, Duel in the Sun? Yeah. Every once in a while they pull it out. And in some of the stuff where they haven't cut it too much, you see Shaw up on the balcony calling down to the group. And I guess that as best he could, despite the fact that he couldn't walk too well, he taught the Varsuviana to Gregory Peck. And was it Jennifer Jones, was it, in that? The other no-no would be what? Drinking. He, in his research that Herb had talked about, going to the mining camps and going throughout the different western areas, trying to get stories and get dances, he tried to find out why square dancing had stopped before, because it was on a great upswing, and this is the early 1900s, and it was, as I remember it, it was because it began to settle into the bar rooms. It began to settle into the places where the characters were not always the greatest influences on anything. And he always looked at that thing and he said, in square dancing you need no artificial stimulation. Square dancing is in itself all a person needs. And if you can hurt the feelings of a single individual by being less than a gentleman or a lady on the dance floor, it's not worth embarrassing anyone. And as Bob said, costume was very important to him. And as a result of the Cheyenne Mountain Dancers, who, as Herb said, traveled from one part of the United States at one time and then came out to the other side of the country on another and would hit Canada, the costumes that they wore full-length dresses, pantaloons clear down to the floor virtually, and those were the costumes as part of their costume that they had. They had a number of costumes, which brings me to my epilogue. Did you have anything you wanted to add before I epilogue? One comment.
Yes, before you wind it down, Bob. To show you what this man, the courage that he had, Pappy Shaw told me that when he took the job as superintendent of Cheyenne Mountain School, he wrote out a resignation and set it in the drawer and said, I'm going to, there's some things I want to do. Of course, many of his activities, the rodeo, as Herb mentions, and several of these things, the football team, I think, disappeared for a few years there because I guess they didn't have that good a team. Maybe they did, I don't know, but there were several things that, maybe you'll come back to that, Herb. Oh, that was it. They didn't have enough people for a football team. That was it, so they had to do other things. But he wrote out this resignation, and finally, at the very end, there was enough parental pressure, and I know exactly of what he talks because it's the reason I left education. Pappy sat with that resignation in the drawer all those years, and finally, when the pressure got on that the people wanted this and wanted that, and they wanted these other things, he then opened the drawer, took out the resignation, and that was the end of his teaching career. But it takes, I've often thought, boy, that takes a lot of intestinal fortitude to write out a resignation on the day you're hired for a job.
Several times we've talked about Pappy walking with canes and so forth, and it was not a result of polio or anything like that, but Pappy was in a horrendous automobile accident 2 blocks from where I lived, as a matter of fact, and
tore his legs up, and so much of what he did was done as really a handicapped person. He had a terrible time getting around, a lot of pain, a lot of trouble, and yet you'd never know it from the way he acted and what he did. But that's why he was a cripple. It was from this really horrendous automobile accident. Pappy had too many things on his mind to be entrusted with a car anyhow. He liked to talk to people in the back seat and so forth.
I imagine that it would be difficult for anyone who may not have had this experience of being with Shaw to understand why it gets through to us and what it has meant. I'm sure I wouldn't be sitting here today, and maybe none of us would be if it hadn't been for the influence and the inspiration and stimulation to the activity that Shaw had given. That's why it gets so deep inside. I think, of all these years of putting out a magazine, putting out records, and all these great fun things that I've had an opportunity to do, and the friends that I've met, gosh, I just don't know. They are so important. Well, let me tell you this last epilogue. I told you, we have time, I think, Herb. I think I told you that about 1948, we just formed 2 associations in our area, and it was the year after several of us had traveled to Colorado Springs for the first time. And we were gung-ho. The newspapers in our area had regular features and columns on square dancing. The magazine was starting. And so we thought, well, let's do the biggest thing we can. Let's bring the Cheyenne Mountain Dancers and Pappy Shaw out to California. And so we set up 2 shows, one on a Thursday night at Hollywood High School Auditorium, a huge auditorium. And then on Monday night, another one in Pasadena Civic Auditorium, another huge auditorium. And the days in between, let's have this clinic that I mentioned that sold out completely with just allowing one couple from each existing club in the area. So it was all planned, and in no time at all the seats were sold for both performances. The theater critics in the newspapers covered what was going to happen, and they had sold-out signs on the ads that ran in the theater pages. So Shaw left Colorado Springs, this was in November, and drove the kids down through Albuquerque and Tucson and into San Diego. And I can't remember whether they had a performance that night or not, but they left early the next morning on the Thursday that they were going to open at Hollywood High School. And they came to the coast. The kids got the first view of the mighty Pacific Ocean. And as they drove up, you've all been, I guess, most of you, to California. You know where La Jolla is, how beautiful that is? They stopped the bus so the kids could get a first-hand look at the ocean. And as kids do, they all got up to the edge, and several of the more adventuresome went down on the rocks down close to the surf. And a wave came and took 3 of them into the surf. 2 of them, they got out safely. Tommy Collins, one of the young dancers, drowned. Now, this was just a little before noon on the Thursday before they were to perform in our area. And as soon as they had gotten themselves back together and sort of had an idea that they would continue on at least to the Los Angeles area, Shaw got on the phone to me. There were only 2 of us that were really in on the direct planning of this, and he said, "Bob, here's what's happened." And he filled me in. He said, "I don't think we're going to go on with the show, but don't cancel it yet. We'll know more when we see you. If you'll meet us at the hotel in Santa Monica, then if it doesn't work, you can be at the theater to refund the money." So they drove on from La Jolla on up to the San Juan Capistrano Mission. And in the meantime, Shaw got on the phone and was able to reach the parents of the young boy. And they said to him, if the kids all feel that they can do it, please go ahead and put on the show tonight and dedicate it to Tommy. So the kids talked it over among themselves, and they had a quiet time in the mission, and they drove on and decided among themselves that they would go ahead and put the show on. Now, when they got to Santa Monica, they said, well, let's do it. Let's not tell anybody. So Ralph Maxheimer and I just decided, okay, we would just keep the thing quiet. And that night, for the performance, they needed every one of the 16 dancers they had for a couple of the big numbers that they did. They did a Lancers in the full dress. They did a Mexican number, Matlanchinas, wouldn't it have been? And then they did some of these great square dances, but they needed every dancer. So in order to fill that 16th spot, that 8th man, they went to the University of Southern California and got a 60-year-old dance teacher. And his name was Jack. And he was absolutely terrific. And he could fit into the costume of this 16-year-old square dancer. No rehearsal, no time. And they went onto that stage ready to go, and just before showtime to this full audience, the curtain opened. Shaw came out with his 2 canes, and he simply said, I'd like to dedicate this show to Tommy Collins. Nothing else. The piano started, the curtains opened, and these kids danced. Joe Fadler was our photographer then, and he was taking pictures above the stage, and he said, I'll swear that those kids were dancing closer to me than they were to the floor. They were dancing a foot off the floorboards. It was a tremendous thing. You can imagine what it would have been like for those kids dancing with this knowledge. By halftime, by the intermission, the word got out and the people in the audience knew. But I've never seen a performance like that. And the reason for bringing this up, it was just one more example to me of the love and the dedication and what went behind the start of the square dance movement in our area. Never forget it. And we, Herb and Bob and I, appreciate your letting us reminisce. We could go on for hours because this just begins to open up the whole thing, but we do enjoy talking about something that's very important to us. Thank you, Herb. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, troops. Yes.
The man that's running the audio tape wanted the audience to know that the voices on the audio tape are clear as a bell. They're not garbled like over the house.
So if anybody wants a copy, it's there. Thank you all. Thank you, Herb. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, sir.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
Hi, dear.
You guys do it better every time you do it.
Thank you, Herb. I think that's our last time.
Let me tell you that I too was that. I was urged to go to that thing for about 5 years and never went. Do you remember George Newbolt's? He was a good friend of mine, and he begged me to go. And I never went.
Not all of this, but
at that time I was young and in college, and I thought,
of course, Pappy was a wonderful man, and so was Dorothy.
You knew them both.
I knew well. They served as honorary host and hostess to the 1958 convention.
I remember that.
And that was the last convention he attended.
It was 58.
It was
that was at the Denver convention.
He passed away that
when
year.
they put on the big pageant.
And Denver, Dorothy talked in 1958 to the convention.
Yes.
You did too.
In fact, I was out with the mermaid.
And she said then that square dancing, one of her main things was square dancing was not going to progress because we wasn't producing the leaders that we had. We was getting the dancers, but we wasn't getting the leaders.
Isn't that interesting?
That's back in many years. So it was very interesting to me about
Yeah, it really was. It's hard not to break down with it. Thank you.
They should have given you a bigger room. I think you'd have
Well, I don't know whether we would or not, but we could always say we had a standing tall. Oh my!
He did this just last. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
I was wondering, I was just curious about your notes here. Tell me, my museum. where.
Sure, I probably. Do you have access to a copy machine?
I'm not here, but I can get it from you.
Well, you can take it now if you can send me. Okay, you maybe send me a copy because if I ever do it again, this just makes that much easier. You betcha.
Give you my card, and I've got
Am I right
out
that
of Buffalo and
after
Toronto.
you
I have, of course, Buffalo's been there. Toronto's
Well,
been many years. Let me give you my card.
You do that.
If you write to me, I'll get those addresses for you. And there's a Scottish Dancing Society that has LPs of Scottish dancing.
I learned from Ed Gilmore that you can call President Square Dancing.
Well,
perfectly, and I would love it.
It's still there. Good. Thank you.
Ed Gilmore was
the first measure.
Is that true?
I think we turned, as I remember. But I can't
You just last all I wired.
Thank you guys for sharing some numbers with us.
You're welcome.
Your original
You got one of the originals? You realize how old that is? That's almost as old as I. I wonder where I can put this so it won't feed back. Right in there. I couldn't figure out how to do that.
What if we put it on the chair back there?
Just going to say, boy, get it away from your ceiling speakers.
I put it in the chair and it fed back.
There you go. There you go.
You hit it.
Yes.
Thank you for coming.
Appreciate it.
That's right. Bob, thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I enjoyed these guys.
I wish I could say it was a pleasure.
You get.
Are we?
Yeah, you're still coming live.